Hello and thanks for joining us for our mid-morning edition of Arirang News. I'm Mark Broom. Let's start by taking a look at the day's headlines. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Washington is on the verge of a new day with North Korea, but stresses international sanctions must be vigorously enforced until the regime has fully abandoned its nukes. Is consumer confidence returning in South Korea? It rebounds in September after a multi-month slide, but questions linger over how long brisk exports and low inflationary pressure can end the long-term downtrend. Plus, making South Korea's roads safer for everyone. It's now illegal not to wear a seatbelt in the backseat of a car. Those caught riding a bicycle under the influence of alcohol will also be penalised. Let's start, though, with the latest developments related to US-North Korea diplomacy. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has hailed what he called the dawn of a new day with North Korea as Washington continues to push for diplomacy to denuclearize the Kim Jong-un regime. Lee Seung-jae starts us off.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is sounding a hopeful note on the diplomatic negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington.
Past diplomatic attempts to halt North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile development were unsuccessful. But now we're at the dawn of a new day.
Chairing a meeting of the UN Security Council on Thursday, Pompeo credited the ongoing international sanctions on North Korea and said the maximum pressure campaign must continue until a final, fully verified denuclearization of the regime is achieved.
We must not forget what's brought us this far, the historic international pressure campaign that this Council has made possible through the sanctions that it imposed. Until the final denuclearization of the DPRK is achieved and fully verified, it is our solemn collective responsibility to fully implement all UN Security Council resolutions pertaining to North Korea.
South Korean Foreign Minister Jeong Kyeong-doo, who also took part in the meeting, said the path toward peace on the Korean peninsula has improved despite the initial bumpy road.
Our path to complete denuclearization and the establishment of a permanent peace on the Korean peninsula might prove likewise uneasy periods of uncertainty and wariness, interspersed by moments of a step change in progress and clear visibility toward our goal. But in the longer scheme of things, comparing where we were a year ago and where we are today, the situation has definitively become more clear and visibility has been greatly enhanced.
Earlier in the day, Pompeo met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Pompeo took the opportunity to reaffirm the need for continued sanctions on the North until a final, fully verified denuclearization is realized. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
So, after months of deadlock, nuclear negotiations between North Korea and the United States are firmly back on track, at least it seems for now. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to the regime next month has basically been confirmed, and a second summit between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is on the horizon as well. Oh Jung-hee has this report.
Last week's Inter-Korean Summit declaration stipulates that North Korea will allow experts to oversee the dismantlement of its Dongchangri missile engine test site and launch pad. It also says if Washington takes, quote, corresponding measures, Pyongyang is also willing to dismantle for good its Yeongbyeon nuclear complex, the regime's key nuclear site that's home to plutonium production facilities and a uranium enrichment plant. With U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo soon visiting North Korea for the fourth time to lay the groundwork for the second Kim-Trump summit, it's believed North Korea-U.S. nuclear negotiations will now revolve around how the dismantlement of Dongchangri and Yeongbyeon will take place and what Washington can offer in exchange.
If Secretary Pompeo visits North Korea or Pyongyang and Washington start communicating through their channel in Vienna, then the key focus will be on how certain nuclear facilities and weapons systems can be dismantled and how that dismantlement can be verified. Also tied in with this will be when the two sides could declare an end to the Korean War.
The corresponding measure North Korea wants the most from the U.S. is a declaration of an end to the Korean War. That, despite being only a political declaration, not a treaty, helps end hostilities between the two sides while opening the possibility of establishing diplomatic relations. The two Koreas aim to declare an end to the Korean War within this year, and Washington is not so opposed to it. But that still remains to be seen, as the U.S. has not made any official mention of it after the Inter-Korean summit last week, and for now wants to first see North Korea take concrete steps towards denuclearization. 우정희, Arirang News.
Now, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at last week's Inter-Korean summit in Pyongyang announced some concrete denuclearization measures, including a conditional shutdown of the regime's main nuclear complex. But a renowned nuclear scientist who is very familiar with the North's nuclear programs has some different views on what to do with that complex. Park Hee-jun reports.
Dr. Siegfried Hecker, an American nuclear scientist, says North Korea's conditional shutdown of its Yeongbyeon nuclear complex would be a very positive sign that demonstrates its willingness to denuclearize. Hecker made the remarks on Thursday during a special lecture hosted by the Yonsei Institute for North Korean Studies. He's visited the complex 4 times, and from what he's seen firsthand, it's functional with some relatively new facilities, which makes it quite a big concession.
If North Korea actually follows through with shutting down, and they said dismantle, that's a very big deal. That would be a huge step of showing that North Korea is actually serious about rolling back its nuclear program.
But he has doubts on whether North Korea will ever give it up. Hecker notes how the complex was an enormous investment for the regime, both in terms of money and pride. Instead, he suggests allowing the North to maintain it partially and convert it from military use to civilian purposes and space programs.
In my opinion, is the risk of letting them keep some of the civilian nuclear facility is worth the potential benefit by working jointly with them in those facilities, and it would be the best chance in terms of eventual verifications.
According to Hecker's 10-year framework, that needs to be achieved through a long process of negotiations that encourages North Korea to make such concrete steps. Under the phased approach, North Korea will be convinced to demilitarize its Yeongbyeon complex. And ultimately, Hecker says that will turn nuclear weapons from a treasured sword to an unnecessary burden that North Korea can let go. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The Inter-Korean Joint Liaison Office is up and running, and the South and North Korean heads are to sit down for their second meeting today. They're expected to focus on holding a joint event in the North Korean capital next week to celebrate the 11th anniversary of their 2007 summit agreement dubbed the October 4th Declaration. They're also expected to discuss follow-up measures on last week's Inter-Korean summit and schedules for their next high-level talks. The two Koreas opened their joint liaison office 2 weeks ago in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, a factory park they ran together until early 2016. The office increases direct communication between Seoul and Pyongyang, with their officials staying there 24/7. South Korea's new defense minister held his first phone call with his American counterpart James Mattis on Thursday evening Korea time. Seoul's Ministry of National Defense says Mattis congratulated Jeong Kyeong-doo on his new role and thanked him for his previous leadership as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Jeong and Mattis also discussed ways of mutually cooperating in order to facilitate denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. The two agreed the allies' close cooperation is needed more than ever in the changing security situation, vowing to continue to further develop the South Korea-U.S. alliance. They also agreed to closely communicate in implementing the recently signed inter-Korean military agreement.
Good morning. As you know, we took the step.
Now, South Korea's consumer sentiment rebounded for the first time in 4 months since September. Data released by the Bank of Korea on Friday shows its consumer sentiment index rose 2.5 points to 101.7, recovering from a dip last month when it fell below the 100 level. A reading above 100 means there are more optimists than pessimists about the economy. A BOK official attributed it to robust exports, the rising stock market, and a slowdown in price increases of food and other livelihood expenses. The same data also showed consumer sentiment on housing prices has climbed by 10 points to 119 this month, a near 3-year high. Now, if you're watching us in Korea, it might be time to grab your credit card to pick up some mega bargains. That's because the nation's biggest shopping tourism festival is called Korea Sale Festa is now on. The massive shopping event, into its 3rd year, offers shoppers a variety of promotions and cultural events, including a wide range of products at bargain basement prices. More than 230 companies are taking part this year, including department stores, online retailers and traditional markets. Hosted by the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, this year's Korea Sale Festa will run through October 7th. The South Korean government plans to allow duty-free shops at arrivals terminals in a bid to reduce discomfort experienced by tourists and to boost domestic consumption. As an initial step, the nation's first arrival duty-free shop will be set up at Incheon International Airport before June next year and gradually be expanded to other airports in the country. The latest measures come after President Moon Jae-in ordered a review of the plan, saying tourists currently have to carry around items they purchase before departure for the duration of their trip due to the lack of duty-free shops at arrivals. Small and medium-sized duty-free operators have welcomed the move, as the government said only smaller firms will be allowed to take part in the bidding process. Now, new regulations designed to help make South Korea's roads safer came into effect today. Car passengers in the back seats will be legally required to fasten their seatbelts, and penalties await people riding a bicycle while under the influence of alcohol. So Bo-bin reports.
Starting Friday, people will be penalized if caught riding a bicycle while drunk. According to the Ministry of Public Administration and Security, under the revised Road Traffic Act, people riding bicycles while intoxicated will have to pay a fine of $30. There was previously a clause prohibiting cycling while drunk, but it wasn't enforced. The new regulations will be effective not only on public roads, but also on bicycle paths such as those alongside the Hangang River. It is also mandatory to wear a safety helmet when riding a bicycle, although no punishment will be imposed when a helmet is not used. Another regulation being enforced is the mandatory use of seatbelts for all seats in vehicles on the road and on highways. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, if people involved in traffic accidents aren't wearing a seatbelt, the chances of death are 2.8 times higher for those in the front seat and 3.7 times higher for those in the back seat. The new regulations aim to reduce the number of deaths from traffic accidents by half by 2022. So Bo-bin, Arirang News.
Now, latest data shows people aged 65 and above make up 1/10 of South Korea's population, and many of them are still working in order to cover various expenses, with the heaviest burden coming from medical costs, which are steadily rising as well. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
South Korea's population is transitioning from an aging society to an aged society, according to standards set by the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Data released by Statistics Korea on Thursday shows around 7.4 million out of the 51.6 million people living in Korea, including foreigners, are classified as being in the elderly population. This means people aged 65 or older make up 14.3% of the country's total population in 2018. It's an increase from last year's 13.9%, and the figure is expected to rise gradually to 41% by 2060. The UN defines an aging society as one in which more than 7% of the population are 65 or older. A country with an aged society means the figure is more than 14%, and for a super-aged society, it's 21%. The same data shows 6 out of 10 elderly people have to work to earn a living, with only about a quarter of them being financially supported by their offspring or relatives. This comes amid rising medical expenses among the elderly population, which amounted to an estimated $3,600 per person a month on average in 2017, a near 5% increase from the previous year. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
The U.S. Federal Reserve has decided to hike interest rates for the third time this year. Now there's added pressure on South Korea's central bank to lift its own key rates as the rate gap between the two countries has now widened to the highest level in over a decade. Kim Hae-sung reports.
In a unanimous move Wednesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised its benchmark federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point to a range of 2 to 2.25% in the Fed's 8th rate hike since 2015.
This action reflects the strength we see in the economy and is one more step in the process that we began almost 3 years ago of gradually returning interest rates to more normal levels.
The Fed forecasts the U.S. economy will grow 3.1% this year, faster than the 2.8% projection back in June, adding it'll continue to expand moderately for at least 3 more years. With the latest increase, the rate gap between Korea and the U.S. has widened to 75 basis points. Finance Minister Kim Dong-yeon and Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol said Thursday that the Fed's rate hike will likely have a limited impact on Korea's capital markets, saying the pace of rate normalization is in line with expectations. Korea's capital market has stayed relatively stable even after the Fed's rate hike in March that made the U.S. rate higher than Korea's for the first time in a decade, but the capital market risk is growing.
Korea has strong economic fundamentals like its current account surplus and record-high FX reserves. But with the rate gap continuing to widen as the US tightens its monetary policy, it could result in volatility in emerging markets and cause capital flight from Korea, as investors look for safer assets like US bonds with higher yields.
Since November 2017, the BOK has kept its key rate at 1.5%, citing sluggish job figures and concerns over the U.S.-China trade spat. But with the Fed signaling another rate hike in December, the pressure is growing on the Bank of Korea to lift its key rate in one of its last 2 meetings this year, in October and November. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Now, the World Trade Organization says world trade growth is likely to be slower than previously thought in 2018 and 2019 amid the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. According to the latest forecast by the WTO, the world trade in goods would grow by 3.9% this year, less than the 4.4% it forecast back in April. A trade growth of 3.7% is expected for 2019, down from its previous forecast of 4%. The Director General of the WTO says while trade growth remains strong, the downgrade reflects the heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing. The UN Human Rights Council has agreed to set up a team that will collect evidence of alleged crimes committed by the Myanmar government against Rohingya Muslims. For more on this and other news from around the world, let's turn to our Noah Adam. So, Adam, just walk us through what this means.
Well, Mark, the so-called independent mechanism, as they call it, is part of a fact-finding mission the UN Human Rights Council previously authorized to help document alleged rights for violations in Myanmar. The main purpose of the body will be to collect and analyze evidence that could be used to pursue criminal indictments against suspected perpetrators. 35 of the Council's 47 members voted in favour of the resolution, while China, the Philippines and Burundi voted against it. 7 countries abstained. So Myanmar's ambassador in Geneva immediately criticised Thursday's move.
The draft resolution is based on serious but unverified accusations and recommendations of the FFN that could even endanger the national unity of the country.
The Burmese military is suspected of raping, murdering and torturing the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State, with UN investigators accusing the army of genocide and war crimes. Both the military and government have denied such allegations. Thursday's resolution will likely raise pressure on military chiefs who might come under investigation, but its potential effect on war crime prosecutions is yet uncertain. Those cases are usually handled by the International Criminal Court, which needs support from the UN Security Council, where China does hold a veto. In other news, US President Donald Trump's pick for the US Supreme Court has angrily and tearfully denied allegations of sexual assault. Brett Cavanaugh said the claims made by university professor Christine Blasey Ford were false, adding his confirmation process had become a, quote, national disgrace.
This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election. This grotesque and coordinated character assassination will dissuade competent and good people of all political persuasions from serving our country.
Ford testified during Thursday's hearing that she was 100% certain that Cavanaugh was the one who sexually assaulted her during their high school years. Cavanaugh was careful not to denounce Ford, however, saying he didn't doubt the professor may have been sexually assaulted by someone in some place at some time, but he insisted he had never assaulted her or anyone. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has filed a lawsuit against Tesla CEO Elon Musk for alleged fraud. According to court documents filed Thursday, the SEC claims that Musk issued, quote, false and misleading statements and failed to notify regulators of material company events. It was in reference to an August tweet in which Musk claimed he had funding lined up to take Tesla private. The lawsuit was filed in federal courts in Manhattan, and the SEC is seeking to bar Musk from serving as an officer or director of a public company, as well as unspecified monetary penalties. In a statement, Musk called the action, quote, unjustified, adding that he acted in the best interests of truth, transparency, and investors.
Good morning. It surely feels like autumn is in full swing. In fact, leaves are starting to change its colors. The picture in the background was taken at Seoraksan Mountain just yesterday. And soon, the whole nation will be painted with the beautiful colors of the autumn leaves. And here in South Korea, the northeast region see the first autumn colors before the changes gradually spread southwest. So those of us in Seoul will need to wait for 2 weeks or so to see the autumn foliage. Big gaps in the readings will continue this Friday, and daily highs will be slightly lower than Thursday with more clouds over the peninsula. And the autumn breeze will bring crisp air, and southern Daegu will see highs of just 23 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Chuncheon will be cooler at 21 degrees. Now, the big temperature fluctuations will persist with mostly sunny skies over the peninsula. So let's make the most of the weather conditions before it gets too chilly. That's Korea for you, and here's international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, that's all we have for now on this Friday morning here in Seoul. Do stay tuned to Arirang TV. We have our next newscast coming up at noon Korea time with our very own Lee Ji-yoon. So until then, goodbye.